Got some notes.
All right. Hi, everyone. Here's my beloved Nicki. Hi, Nick.
Hi.
You can grab your notes. Don't worry. It's a very casual affair here.
All right, I got them pulled up.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, or I invited the members of our legacy trip on the podcast to have a conversation. We are now a month later. And we've been home for a month. And so I want to start with why you chose to go, what kind of led you to the trip, and a little bit of the backstory that brought you to our December adventure.
Yeah. Okay, so the short answer is that I really just wanted to meet Nandi K in person and cultivate some deeper relationships on my anti-racism journey. But the longer answer to all of that was that I started following Tina Strawn on Instagram in 2019, right? And joined Tina's Patreon community in late November 2019. So when I heard about the legacy trips, I just knew I wanted to go on a trip like that one day because I had visited the Legacy Museum and the memorial in 2018 with some friends. And so I just knew like, I want to go back and I want to go on a trip where someone can help me actually process what I'd gone and done in 2018. Right. And then Tina, just the way Tina loves people and sees the humanity of people really drew me in as I saw Tina keeping that at the center of the work that they're doing. And so I was curious, right, about participating in a trip like that. And honestly, I was thinking about shame and guilt being such primary motivators for me early in my journey because they were such motivators within my evangelical Christian context to do anything. And so getting out of that mindset of shame and guilt being my motivators, right? I really wanted to change as a person, not just modify my behavior. And I was seeing that happen with Tina and the way that Tina approached anti-racism, right? And so, and the people surrounding Tina. And then one of the trips was led by Letty Gore, who is a historian who I've gotten to know through Instagram and her Patreon community. So I was like, I want to go on that trip. But then it was the weekend before my kids started school. And so I was like, then I keep looking at the trips, right? And then I see that there's a trip in December being facilitated by Nandi K and Corey Leak. And I had heard from both of them in webinars with Tina, right? And so in one of the webinars, Nandi K and Tommy Allgood talked about cancel culture. And I just remember crying because of this redemptive aspect that they kept coming back to in the conversation. And so when I started a podcast, I had reached out to Nandi. And so Nandi was a guest in seasons 2 and 3 of my podcast. So when I found out that Nandi was facilitating a trip with Corey, and that was in December, I was like, I can't sign up fast enough. And with all of that, I wanted to experience it with Stephen, my husband, who was on the trip with us as well. And in some ways, Steve and I have been growing and evolving together, but he'll tell people things like, wherever Nicki is, like, I'll be there in 3 months or longer, sort of jokingly. But it's like, I wanted to feel, I didn't want to go do this by myself. And so it's like this trip at this time, also because I wanted to experience it with Stephen. And so we talked about it and decided to go together. So that's sort of the longer answer of it as well.
What was that conversation with Stephen like? Was he down from the beginning, or did it take him a little bit of time, or were you even nervous about asking him? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, no, I wasn't nervous about asking him. So with our relationship early on, when I started asking questions specifically regarding anti-racism and white supremacy, he was pretty receptive, and he hopefully I've talked with him about being interviewed by you, so hopefully he'll do it. but
I hope
and he
so.
can share more of his own journey. But yeah, it was just kind of like we had really good conversations about that. And then there were just harder conversations. But when it came to white supremacy, he was a little resistant at first, which I think is normal. But not like with other areas of our lives. And so I wasn't nervous to bring this up to him because we'd already had some really good conversations. As far as like the money commitment and aspect of it, that was probably what I was most nervous about, being like, hey, can we spend this much money to do this thing together? But yeah, I mean, just presenting it to him as I want to do this together and I want to feel like we're in this together. And he was pretty receptive to it.
Yeah, I hope I get a chance to chat with him. I want to go back to something you said about the conversation on cancel culture with Nandi and Tommy. Do you remember what the elements were? Was there anything specific that really stuck with you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it was really beautiful to hear them, like the way that I perceived cancel culture was sort of this rallying people against someone and it's like, we're done with you. But then the way they framed it was this, there's accountability. So there can hopefully be repair, and we see the humanity of the person on the other side. And like, I cried on that call because at that point I hadn't been in church for a little while, but I was like, that felt like God to me.
The repair aspect, like the human aspect.
And something that even in Christian church culture, I just don't see much of. Like, it's like the person is either a monster, or or we give them a pass for whatever reason, and so for it to be like, no, it's both, and it's accountability and grace,
and how that's like not part of most of our family systems. So it hasn't really evolved into our societal systems. And so these issues that we have on the very like primary primal family level have elevated now that we're really talking and diving into topics that need to be dismantled and pulled apart and uprooted. We're using those old patterns a lot of the time. So I think that there are aspects of cancel culture that don't have repair. And I love that we're broadening the narrative, as one might say. That's the name of Nicki's podcast. That's why I'm laughing. Opening up to be like, yes, there's, cancel culture is not just this, it's accountability and repair as well, and growth. Like, we can't grow if we don't know, right? I love that. Okay. So I want to know, what are the biggest, since I've been back, a lot of people have said to me, oh, I'm going to go take my family, or I'm going to go by myself. And I have been encouraging them to do a community-based trip, Black-led trip, I'm just encouraging that. So tell me a little bit about the difference for you of going alone or on your own. It sounded like you went with some friends versus a community Black-led trip. What are those takeaways like for you?
Yeah. So when I was preparing for this, I kind of get into some of this because of the question you asked about what did you think you might experience, right? So I had this one thing I could kind of look back to as having gone before. But it's like when I went in 2018 with some friends, I carried all this grief during and after the trip, but I didn't have community afterwards, like what we had on our trip, to really be able to process once I left the memorial and left the museum. And once I was home, and it wasn't because those people didn't care about me, and it wasn't because they weren't available for processing what we went through, but because none of us at that time were really prepared and equipped to deal with processing trauma like that. Right. And what we'd witnessed, and to kind of move that through our bodies at that time, we went together, and it was an experience that I'm grateful for. But when I came back, it was like, oh, I spiraled. It felt like there was some personal stuff in my life as well. And I just didn't know how to ask for help after it, how to process. Right. And so, yeah. So then coming on this trip, I was like, okay, I'm going to experience sadness. I'm going to experience deep grief. Right. There's going to be heaviness about this history that we're confronting, but I really hoped just to make some connections and to have some healing community, just because the people who I know who I'm becoming with Tina, right? And so it was like I just trusted that other people were kind of on that same healing journey. And yes, that was kind of how the two compared in a way. Because yeah, I mean, I will say I did experience that gravity that I knew I would, and that I suspected I would, but this time it was mingled with more curiosity, I would say, about what I was feeling, why I was feeling it. And even when we went all together and we walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and Corey asked us to think of a word to describe what the people who crossed the bridge during the Selma to Montgomery marches might have been feeling, the word that came to me was this resolve, right? An abiding commitment to face and fight injustice, even at great cost. And so I heard you humming while we walked, right? And I started humming to myself a song that brings me some comfort. And then when you told me to place my hands on one of the stone columns at the bridge and hear the stories from the stones, I was like tearing up when you explained why. And so I was hoping you could explain why you told me to do that, because I thought it was really beautiful.
I think just intuitively the embodiment of what are the elements that have been holding the stories and the memories. Like that's a very Jewish, earth-based Jewish tradition, is to look at the elements that are around and involve them in the process. So I was hearing so much from the trees. And then walking back, touching, feeling the stones, it was like vibrating of just see us too. Like it felt like the stones were also holding grief and stories and memory, because what we did was such a pilgrimage to truly honor the sacredness of the site felt like visceral. And I felt like energetically you were open, you would be someone who would be open to receiving that. That was kind of my ancestor guidance, was like, invite this lovely human in to feel this. And if it's not for her, she'll tell you. It's okay.
Yeah, no, I just remember that being really impactful to think about this idea. And I even saw where you posted about the trees. And I think one of the pictures of the trees that you had was from over the bridge, right? And so,
and it was so, if you see that picture, or you don't need to see that specific picture to understand that there was, that it was so sad. It was desolate, this tree area. It looked like something that had been left behind and was holding grief and sadness with such grace and dignity. Like aging in itself. I don't know. That's kind of where I'm at with it now. A month later is like, especially just because of all the stuff going on with the earth and our own human stories that are weaving with how we're treating the earth right now. So the stones and the trees feel really important part of the story to listen to.
Yeah. I think even just that practice of like being still and listening and envisioning what the stones have witnessed or what the trees have witnessed is like impactful. And so that was really big for me. And so thanks for inviting me into that. Yeah. And, after that, right, we went to the memorial, and it was like these tears just welling up in my eyes before even getting to the columns, right? And like the columns have the names of people who were lynched, and reading, even just walking up to those, reading the different things, just tears welling up, right? And then Stephen and I, we walked around and we decided we were going to look for counties we were connected to in South Carolina where we've lived. And so if it's okay with you, I wanted to share those names and counties and just read those.
Please.
So we saw the names David Cook, Wesley Williams, and Thomas Price in Kershaw County. Yeah. And I think it was Angela, who was someone else in our group, who talked about seeing people with the same last name as her and then realizing what that meant, most likely, of her ancestors enslaving Black people. And my maiden name is Williams. So that name, seeing it Wesley Williams on the column. Some more names in a different county. We saw Daniel Blakeney and Hardy Gill in Lancaster County, Willie Liepert, Tom Preston, Will Thompson, Handy Kagler, Ben Gates, Flute Clark, William Allen, and one person whose name was not recorded in Lexington County, Richard Singleton, Simon Cooper, and Dillard Wilson in Sumter County. And then in York County, where we currently live, John Johnson, Frank Elliott, Bailey Dowdle, Daniel Roberts, Giles Good, Mose Limscomb, Friendly Thompson, Nathan White, and Jefferson Crawford. And so it was like the horror of it all that had affected me in 2018 still hit me all over again as I read about those instances that we know about, and like understanding that there's people we don't know about, right? And a really impactful time was seeing some names there at the memorial and then going to the museum and seeing those same names. And then you get more context for their stories. And some of those names I noticed were the names of two little girls, two small children. And I just felt this anger rise up in me. And then when we talked about it later and we processed that evening together, and I can't remember who said it, but it was something like, we read the reasons for these lynchings, but we know like those aren't the reasons, right? Especially when you look at, I don't remember what their ages were, but like 2 and 4-year-old little girls, right? Like, the reason, right? Like you can see the reason that you want to come up with to justify it on this plaque or something, right? Or whatever the white people in that county or community told themselves, but like the reason is white supremacy and terror at the root of that. And so that was so tough, right? And so when Corey shared about him feeling angry and wondering, like, where were you, God? Like, where were you in this? And like, I just felt that question in my body, right? Like, where were you, God? Which is a question I've been asking a lot the past few years. And so really just taking that all in when Corey then said, hearing the songs as you get ready to leave and being like, oh, there you were, like in the songs. And I remember you even, just talking about for the Jewish community songs as well. And so it's like, oh, there you were, like in these songs, divinity in these songs. And like, so I'm crying as he's saying that, right? Because it just clicked in me as he's talking and he's explaining, yes, like the divinity on display and the resistance of, in the context where we were, of Black people throughout the centuries to present day, like bringing it all the way to now. And so, I just thought it was really beautiful every night to gather around with each of you those 2 nights and to just talk about what we were feeling in a community, and where I felt love, both in the sense of like, I feel loved in this space and I feel love in this room. And that it was this transcendental love that again is just very new to me to feel. And like, it's interesting, Steve and I were talking about like conversations to have with our kids about what to look for in a potential partner, right? Like as you get older. And Steven
And
was
your
like,
kids are 4, 7, and 9. No.
4, 5, and 7, right? Yeah. So like down the road, what do we want to say to them? Let's practice it. No, but this idea of like, this idea of find someone who you enjoy being with. Because for us, it was like find someone who believes the same way you do.
Yeah.
But what happens when you no longer believe the same way? Right. And so this idea of what I saw, and I know it's not exclusive to just evangelical Christian culture, but it's like that was my context. So that's kind of all I feel comfortable speaking to. So I know it was there, this idea of you want to line up with each other on all the things. And of course, like I think there are some non-negotiables when it comes to you want to find someone who loves people, and by love, like not just in a say they love people, but in a dismantle systems of oppression, right? Like that, but in the sense of, I mean, oh man, the rigorous, like not wanting to be unequally yoked, as the terminology was like vetting each other. Like, what do you believe about marriage? Like before you're even dating, right? You want to make sure you match up well with this person. And then, like what happens when you don't anymore? And so I know for a lot of friends that we know, that can be the end of it, and maybe rightfully so. But for us, it's been hard, but we have evolved together. And so just wanting, and I mean, I think it's because we like each other, like I'm in it with this human because, I see the best of him and the best in him, and what he's aspiring to be. And like none of us are our aspirational selves all the time, right? And so to just think like find someone you just enjoy being with, who has this openness and this curiosity, and then you can grow together. Because you'll just like each other. And so that's kind of just experiencing this love that transcended what I felt within these confined boxes. It was like the love I felt in evangelical Christianity was based on belonging to the same group.
Right.
And so being in this space out on the legacy trip, it was like, oh, we're not all part of the same quote group, religiously speaking, but like we can be bound to one another over some shared values, and enjoy being together and have an openness, a compassion, and a curiosity together. So that's kind of what I was thinking for what it felt like.
That diversity of our group is what builds deep trust and growth. Being in homogeneous grouping, it's like we've grown out of that. Like it doesn't work. It's not a way to evolve forward for the problems we have in the world, the conversations we want to be having for the growth and development. So much deep trust is created within diverse communities that are foundational, like with an aim and a vision and a heartfulness of change and transformation, right? If that's our foundation, that's what we're all there for. The diversity brings richness and depth and trust that is not, it's so interesting to have been in that group, given how many Jewish groups I'm in, because we have a lot of diversity within our Jewish bodies and our Jewish ancestry. And yet there's a thread of sameness. And so it's really interesting to be in different types of groupings and see what kind of level of conversation comes up. And even what kind of challenging or accountability that leads to more critical thinking and more discernment, rather than just affirmation and validation for being right or something like that. And having different, I think at different times, this week there was an incident, a difficult incident in a synagogue in Texas, and I did only really want to be with Jewish people for a few hours. Like that's who I trusted. I was feeling a threat response. And so I was like navigating, I was in a space that was non-Jewish as it was unfolding, and could notice myself being kind of looking over my shoulder, where can I be? So I think it's fluid, and I think it's important to have a variety of communities depending on the context, where the diversity adds to the discernment, the accountability, and the growth. And that's what I feel like we did together in a way that I couldn't have even imagined, because it didn't even occur to me that we would have so much evangelical Christian over our group. I spent almost no time. So I'm like, wow, this is so fascinating. Love it. Give me more. Tell me about how you're learning about racism. What's your history with this? Fascinating.
Yeah. So one of my, in 2021, I started listening more regularly to the Armchair Expert with Dak Shepard.
Yeah. I love it.
Okay, but listen, when the podcast started in 2018, I didn't start my anti-racism journey till 2017. So I'm just gonna admit, like in 2018, I was like, I'm not listening to any white men, right? Like that's where I was at that point. And so I didn't dive into it, even though I loved Dak Shepard as an actor and what I knew about him as a person. I was like, well, I'm gonna use my time to soak up these other things. And I'm glad I did. But every once in a while, an episode would come across my feed and I'd be like, oh, I'm going to check that one out. And then I started listening to more and more. So now like when I commit to something, I'm like, I'm going all in. So I went all the way back to the beginning and started listening. And I told Stephen, I was like, I think what's really cool is that I'm going to get to hear the evolution of this white man who is wrestling with certain things, right? It's kind of going to be, I get to see his journey in a way. And I'm listening faster than one episode a week, right? So I'm going to see that journey quicker. And he reminds me a lot of the men of my family in his certainty and certain things he says and claims he makes and all this stuff. But I think what sets him apart is his introspection. He will come back and say, I was wrong. Right. And so anyways, he was talking with Brene Brown on an episode, and she said something to him about how we're more disconnected, even though we've siloed off into our groups where everyone's the same, we're more disconnected. And that it's because we're bonding with people over a common enemy. Like here's who's out of our group. And then people don't feel safe within the group to share what they like, because you've bonded over what you hate together. And so I don't know, like I feel so much more safety now in relationships, because like you said, we're coming from a certain foundation that's true of us, but we hold all this space for more nuance and even like, as long as it's not a non-negotiable, right? There's so much more freedom and safety to say, oh, well, the way I was looking at it was this, so that was kind of what came to my mind as you're sharing that. And I've just been
also, I feel like
that.
saying nothing, like sometimes I would just be listening and just listening. And it was a gift to just say, I just want to sit here and listen. I want to hear this diverse group of experiences. How was this like for you? What was this like for you? And just really take it in. That's what I really appreciate about our trip in person, and the spaciousness and just that debrief time. As you've been back in your life, I guess, to start to like wrap up, what now?
Yeah. So I mentioned this earlier, but after the trip in 2018, right, there was this spiraling for me because of things in my personal life, as well as having gone on that trip, right? And back then I didn't really know how to honor what I was feeling or how to put boundaries around what I was consuming, even the content and the amount of information that I was taking in. Right. And so now I'm like, oh, I'm a human. I don't have a never ending capacity to consume. And it's something I'm still working on. But on that trip in 2018 at the museum store, I remember I purchased the Lynching in America report. And on page 12 of the third edition, I read, in York County, South Carolina, nearly the entire white male population joined the KKK after it was formed. And if you remember, York County is where I live. And when I was listing those names or reading the names, York County, out of those ones that I read, had the most lynching victims, right? 9 names in York County.
Okay, go ahead.
So yeah, in 2018 at the museum store, I purchased the Lynching in America report. And on page 12 of the third edition, I read that in York County, South Carolina, nearly the entire white male population joined the KKK after it was formed. And so York County is where we live. And that was one of the places where I read some of the names. And there were 9 names listed there, which was the most out of the ones that I read of the counties that were connected to. And so when I read that after having gone in 2018, I just had this despair. And I didn't have anyone to help me process that despair, right? And there's all this depression and isolation as a result. But after our trip, right, I didn't have that same feeling of despair. And I think, one, it was the growth that I've experienced since 2018, but also I think because of the community and the connection that I was part of that weekend, right? So for starters, I had Stephen with me on a 6-hour drive back home to process with, right? And then you were intentional about making sure that we all stayed in touch, and had asked me, like, what's the easiest way for you as mom of 3 young kids to communicate with each other, and being on Marco Polo has just been so sweet to see your faces and to kind of help me get acclimated back to real life, but to also get some tips on that from the group about how to integrate. And and I will say, like, I'm still very new to like this embodied living and integration and therapy boundaries, basically anything that helps someone be emotionally healthy. Very new to all of it. And so there's a lot of knowledge that I have. Like, I have all this head knowledge about how to move trauma through my body that I've read, but not a lot of practice with it. And so, this is something that I'm learning to implement. And so when we got back, it was really difficult to sort of jump back into our lives. And Amy shared some things that I wanted to do, and I haven't yet, like about the baths and the different types of salts. But a couple of things that I have done since getting back to try to help me that have kind of become my non-negotiables are a daily walk and 30 minutes of quiet time, which is very different from in my evangelical context, quiet time and reading my Bible. And that is not what I do anymore. During my quiet time, I do a lot of breathing during my like solitude. Like, I'm blocking everything out. I'm not taking anything new in right now. And so, like, I started with 15 minutes and have now gotten to 30 minutes trying to build that stamina. That's a little bit of what life's been like until the past week with COVID-19, as you know, hitting our house, and life's been a bit of a blur since then. That's been a little bit of what it's been like coming back.
And what's next? What do you feel? Was there anything? It's okay if not, because I don't remember if I asked you this before, but anything now that you feel more like solid or grounded, where you see clearly that where your anti-racist journey is going, or like, what are the next steps, or what do you feel stronger about sharing? I know you have a podcast where you can share about that. And is there any other things that became clear after this trip for what your experience is going to be like?
I think it just further solidified that I want love to guide me. That's been such a cornerstone the past couple years for me. I had a very dear friend, Miss Donna Powell, who passed away because of cancer last year. And I got to interview her on the podcast. And she had said something to me early on in my journey about how we make everything so complex, but it all comes down to love. And that stuck with me. And that's what I talked with her about. And so, yeah, after being on the trip, it's kind of just this further solidifying that like, I want love to guide me, not fear. I don't want to be led by fear. And, like the Bible verse, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love, or something like that. See, I'm like getting terrible at, I used to be able to like do these things. But I keep thinking like, with all the stuff with COVID, which is inextricably tied to racism, right? Like that, what we're seeing happen with communities and what we're seeing, the white supremacy in the opposition towards, even a mask mandate, right? Or even a mask suggestion, like, how dare you? And so my brother had said to me, we wore masks to one of my cousin's weddings last May, an outdoor wedding, and we still wore masks, more so as especially when we saw that some of the only Black people there were wearing masks. We were like, okay, then we're going to wear our masks, and so it's like prioritizing other people. Right. And so when my brother said to me, well, faith over fear, my response is, well, what about love over faith? Right? Like, what about love driving us? And so if my neighbor, right, is telling me, and neighbor in that broad sense of another human being, if my neighbor is saying, this is the way you can show love to me, then I'm going to do that. And I'm going to believe this person, that they understand their experiences better than I will, and know that it doesn't feel loving when I do fill in the blank. So yeah, I think that just further solidified that for me, to drill down into love and to couch myself there, and to let that guide me.
I'm just pausing to take that in and encouraging, like in myself and my mind's eye right now, I'm just seeing love through action and love through like actual mini visuals of daily life, right? That it's not something that's just being experienced in my body, but rather as a lifestyle habit.
Yeah.
And I think one of the big takeaways for me that Corey had said, or just kept saying, was this work is our inner work. Like the more that we clear out our emotional patterns and fear and shame and everything we're holding on to, the clearer the love action becomes. And that's like layering what he said with what you said, and it is really a gift, I think, for everybody. So thank you.
Yeah.
To close, will you tell everyone about your upcoming book and your podcast, and where people can learn more about your wonderful wisdom and hear your voice on the page and in their ears?
Yeah. So I finished my I guess what some people call the vomit draft of a memoir that is currently titled Restored Dignity, Establishing My Identity Apart from the Pastor my life revolved around. And so it really details some of that relationship that I had with the pastor for 10 years, and how I left that church. And really, like I read this book, The Memoir Project. I don't know if you've read it, but she talks about how Marion Roach Smith, how a book comes down to an argument that you want to convince your readers to believe. And so I think the argument is that you lose yourself when you live for the approval of someone who's not yourself. And so that's kind of even been part of all of my journey, is how to, like, at the end of it, like, I'm accountable to myself. And so not bending to whatever this powerful person in my life says, but yeah. And there was something that I saw on Instagram that I think kind of even connects back to this when we had gotten back from Qasim Rashid, where he wrote, some white people in U.S. history were slave owners and other white people were abolitionists. Parents who think teaching about America's history of racism shames white kids should reflect on why they think white kids will associate more with slave owner guilt than with abolitionist pride. And when I saw that and I thought about my own kids and writing this book and doing this podcast and my inner work and my own healing and my anti-racism journey, like all of it is like first and foremost so that I can get healthy, right? But then I know like my kids, like they're going to be secondary beneficiaries of any growth any growth I can give in my own nervous system and can share with them and can help them grow. So a lot of it comes down to just trying to pave this path for my kids and to journey alongside them and to learn from them. And so, yeah, so they've helped me a lot, even not in a codependent, they need to take care of mommy because like I'm the adult, I need to take care of me. But in the like, they've been through a lot, like leaving church, they lost their whole community too. And I don't know how it's all gonna play out. And we've been part of an online church community in Hawaii, even though we're in South Carolina, for the past year. So I'm like, I will go to church. And, what?
Couldn't get further from South Carolina.
I can't find anything around here. We will.
Yeah, right. Literally for miles.
Yeah. And so that's been really beautiful and healing and seeing them. Yeah, it's just been really cool. And so, yeah, there's the book. And that hopefully, I don't know, I'm not going to put a super strict timeline on it, but I'd like to publish it by September in honor of my birthday this year, in September. And then, yeah, I do have a podcast called Broadening the Narrative where I just have really beautiful conversations with people who are broadening that narrative that was a very narrow narrative that I was taught within evangelical Christianity, and have had really sweet conversations. And I don't know what season 4 will look like. I told Stephen, I think I'm going to try to do a lot of interviews and then just release them later, like get kind of which I did for season 1 and a little bit for season 2, but by season 3, I was like, started off great and then was scrambling at the end, like felt this pressure of, which on your podcast, you talked with someone about this, like early in one of the earlier episodes, like just letting the podcast, like for your friend, her podcast be like, oh, well, I'll come back to it kind of thing. And so I think just taking that pressure off myself and to see again, like I'm learning that I have limits and that that's okay.
Amen.
Yeah. So
I think I just want to say this because it's so clear. That sense of urgency and sort of keep going, keep more is so inherently part of white supremacy culture narrative.
Yeah.
So I want to pause and savor this moment of unhooking from the need to know season 4, then season 5, then season 6, like the endless amount of production. And that key is, for me, is if the creative flow is not in the channel, then it does become something, again, externally motivated, which is part of where our power has shifted and been lost, and part of how the control has been the narrative over, this is where the whiteness harms everybody. Whiteness harms everybody. And so just the revolutionary act of having something you love and just saying, I don't know, I'm just going to pause, or I'm going to do this step and then we'll see what happens, is a real beautiful integration for allowing our children to live more full lives away from just work and productivity and urgency. and really starting to dig deeper into worthiness and our own worthiness and value being tied to something external. And that's something that I just always want to be in relationship with, you know, like what are these areas of white supremacy culture that are harming all of us in all of these different ways? And where do we begin to slow down? Right. And it's that love over anything, faith, fear, shame, you know, loving self, creativity, love, all of that. Okay. You're the bestest. I could talk to you forever and ever.
I know.
Once you publish your book and I read it, then we'll have you come back on and talk about your book and we can do a whole chitty chat around religion stuff, which would be super fun.
Yes, I would love that. I would love that. Thank you for asking me. It was such an honor to be here.
Love, love, love you. You're such a gift. Thank you.